This morning, when we were worshiping during the first service, there was just kind of something that really felt like I needed to say, and maybe it's specific to this morning, maybe it's just something I should say occasionally. But I think there's this tendency sometimes to come into a room like this with some sort of expectation. And maybe for you, you come in. I know for me, when I'm sitting where you're sitting, I come in with some expectation. I come in, sometimes I come in resistant. Sometimes I come in waiting for somebody to prove something to me. That's my tendency. I'm a little jaded, and I tend to be a skeptic. And so sometimes I come into a room like this, and my guard's up. Sometimes I'm just looking for someone to tell me something I don't already know. And so, as if that's what God really wants, is you to have more information. And this morning while we were worshiping in our first service, and I'll just say it's kind of consistent in this service today, I just want to encourage you this morning to be vulnerable and to understand that your vulnerability is where God has the opportunity to work in your life. That there are these moments for us where when we drop our guard, when we admit there are parts of my life that aren't going well, that's usually when God has the opportunity to come through that door and start working. And so I just want to encourage you this morning as we move forward in this series and in this story this morning we're looking at, be vulnerable. Just if you could just relax, drop your guard, take the skeptic out of you for a moment, because I think God wants to do some things in our hearts and our lives. We live in a very broken world, and it's very evident to me, very evident that we live in a broken world. This week I was thinking about this, and there was this image that popped in my mind. It's actually an image where most of us are familiar with, and it's an ancient ruin. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. And I thought, that just kind of reminds me of the world that we live in today. It's just off, right? Just like over here, right? It's interesting. When you read about the Leaning Tower of Pisa, here's what's fascinating. Like, when they started building it, when they got to the third story, the foundation started shifting and it started tilting. So when they got to the second row of columns, that's when the thing started moving. Like, we have a problem here. And then they kept building. Like City of Spokane, can you imagine today? What would they say about that, right? Like, hey guys, this thing's going to end up over there. I know it's supposed to be here, but we're going to, I don't know, just keep building, right? So let's just add another column. And they just kept going, right? I look at this thing and I just think, I see pictures of tourists when they gather around it, and I'm like, don't stand there, right? I mean, don't you I know it's been there for a few hundred years, but so's that pine tree in your neighbor's yard that every time the wind blows and you're like, today's the day, it's coming over, right? It's going to take me out, right? It's not okay. It's not all right. And I try to put myself in the mind of somebody who, the guy showed up, the engineer, and he's like, guys, we got a problem. Oh, it doesn't matter. Really? Yeah, we'll just keep going. Just keep building. It's interesting because when I think about us in our life, I feel like this is a great depiction of our lives and the world that we live in. We're beautiful. You're beautiful. You're made in the image of God. You're beautiful. You're intricate. You're amazing. You're like this ancient ruin. Some of you more ancient than others, but you know what I'm saying? You're this amazing, beautiful, intricate human being. There's something that's fabulous about you. And yet there's something that when you acknowledge it, when you recognize it, when we look at our world, we live in this amazing world, humanity, we're beautiful together. We have these moments in humanity when we go, man, that is so amazing and so beautiful. But then there's this other side of it where we acknowledge and we can recognize we're just off a little, right? Some of you, the person next to you, you're actually off a little more than I am, right? So we're intricate, we're beautiful, but we're off. And the reality is, for so many of us, the pattern of our life is that we realize that we're off, but we just keep building, right? It's like there's this little part of us that goes, man, I know that there's something that's moving me in the wrong direction. I realize things are tilted, we're off kilter here, but we just have this tendency in the world that we live in, the culture that we're embedded in, we have this tendency to just continue to build. Like we just go, let's keep going. I mean, that's the only thing we know to do, right? So we'll just keep building. Let's just add another story, add another layer, put some more arches on. We'll just keep moving around because that's just what we do. And so we find ourselves in this place where we feel like this, don't we? Don't you feel like this sometimes? Don't you feel like this is our world? Like we're almost there, but just... And when we open up the Bible and we see these stories, we see this. We open up the Bible and we see stories in the Old Testament, especially, we see David's life. You see the offness of it, right? But then there are these moments, and especially with David's life, I think this is why 2,000 years we still talk about him. There are these moments in David's life when he responds to a circumstance or faces a situation and does something a different sort of way. There are these moments that as you read the pages of Scripture and you see these stories, yes, we see the offness of the world we live in, but then we have these glimpses where it's as if the hand of God is reaching into the circumstances and he's shoving this thing right again. We see David respond to things, and there's something that resonates inside of us because we go, that's the way this is supposed to be. It's like we can see God writing this thing. So the reality is that's God's heart for us. God's heart is that this thing would be straight and upright. God has a dream for you as a person, for us as a group, for humanity as a whole. Like God has a heart for this whole thing, and it's to see this moved back to this place. And that's not going to happen by us just continuing to build, us just continuing to add more layers and keep doing what we've always done. That just keeps us moving in this other direction. What it requires is an opposing force. It requires us coming in and doing something different to move this thing back the other way. There's so many examples of this. Freedom. Freedom is a great example of this. Freedom is an example that I think is something that we pursue. We go after it. Like we love the idea of freedom in our culture, especially in our nation. Like we all want to be free. Like that's really important to us. So we fight for freedom. We defend our freedom. We fight for our rights. We're dedicated to it. But you know what's interesting is when you think about freedom the way we think about freedom in our culture, what we fight for and what we defend isn't really freedom. It's actually the means by which we believe we will obtain freedom. But it really isn't freedom, is it? We have an idea of freedom and what it is. It's rights, it's protection, it's individuality, it's nobody telling us what to do. Like those are the things that we would define as freedom. But what's really interesting is that in a culture that values that more than anything else, we don't look very free, do we? We may not be being told what to do by a dictator, but how free are we really? How free are you really? See, the way that we define freedom, the way that we're building freedom up in our lives, it's a means that we've decided this is what will make freedom happen. But the reality is that freedom is something that we feel. Freedom is something that we experience. Freedom is something that's actually difficult for us to put into words, isn't it? Like when you're out on a hike and you walk up to the edge of a cliff and you see a bird that's catching the wind as it moves up and it lifts its way, there's that moment where you can almost feel freedom. Like that's freedom, right? You see a child that's playing in their yard, unburdened by the cares of this world. And what do you think? I mean, there's this lightness to that moment, right? When you see children playing, what is that lightness that you feel? What is that? That's freedom, right? freedom is something that we feel. Freedom is something that's inside of us. And we confuse the means with the reality of freedom. Even more troubling is this, and this is something that many of us have experienced. Even more troubling is when you encounter somebody who doesn't have the rights that we have. When you meet somebody whose so-called freedoms or the means to freedom have been taken from them, and you hear their story, you listen to their conversation, or you watch them respond to something and you realize, you're more free than I am. You ever had that? Like you meet someone and you go, that person, that looks free. And yet nothing about your circumstances says you should be free. We look at stories like the stories that we're looking at with David, and what you realize is that there's the potential that we could be adding layers to our life, but not ever straightening this life, not ever thinking differently enough or seeing things differently enough for this life to be what God dreamt it could be. And there's this moment in David's life that we're going to look at today when he makes a statement. He says something that's really simple. It's really obscure. In fact, when we look at this, I'll just say to you, like, I've read the story over and over and over again, and it wasn't until this week that I just saw this, and I thought, wow, look at how subtle this is, but look at how powerful it is. David says something, and he responds in a particular way, and it's as if you can see the wind lifting David out of the chaos and out of the mess, and you can sense the freedom. You can feel it. It's tangible. It's something that's present as he speaks. And it doesn't happen the way that you think it would. David has a son. His name is Absalom. And there's all kinds of stuff that we're going to kind of move past because we're looking at David's life and not just walking through all these verses. But if you want to read about a broken world, just read David's family life. Like, it's crazy, some of the stuff that went on. In fact, Absalom, one of the first places we really get introduced to Absalom is when he kills his brother who had slept with his sister. So that gives you a glimpse of the brokenness, the tiltedness of David's world. Absalom is this guy who avenges his sister's dignity and kills his brother. And there's this kind of broken season in David's home. But then we get reintroduced to Absalom again in 2 Samuel chapter 15. If you have a Bible, I just want to ask you to turn there, and if you don't, the words will be on the screen. But this is where we get reintroduced to this son of David. This is David's son. This is David's boy, right? This is like one of his kids. It says in verse 1, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early. And by the way, that first thing, I don't know what that's all about. Is that how he entertained himself? Hey, let's go. I'm going to get my chariot, my horses, and you guys run out in front of me. Apparently that was cool to do back then. It was like cruising in your convertible. I don't know. But anyway, so Absalom used to tell his friends to run in front of him and chase him. That's what it looks like to me. But he used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, from which city are you? And when he said, your servant is of such and such tribe in Israel, Absalom would say to him, see, your claims are good and right, and there's no man designated by the king to hear you. So he would hear people, he'd see people, hey, where are you from? And then basically what he's saying is, do you realize you're not being fairly represented in the government? This is taxation without representation. Your congressman isn't listening to you. That's what Absalom would do. Where are you from? Oh, you know what? I heard about your problem. That's a legitimate problem. Unfortunately, nobody's taking you seriously. That's what Absalom's doing. Then Absalom would say, oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. You can see, this guy would fit perfectly in the American political system, right? Just slap a tie on this guy and make him run for office, right? And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand, and he would take hold of him and kiss him. It's this welcoming kiss. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. And so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. It's fascinating. As you read on in this passage, you see that he continues to do this for 4 years. For 4 years, Absalom stands at the gate and he lures people's loyalty to himself. He creates dissension in his father's kingdom, and eventually this leads to an insurrection, a revolt. There's this battle, this division that takes place in David's kingdom. Now, what's fascinating about this is you see Absalom doing this. This is what we assume in our culture. We look at Absalom, and the first thing we think is, well, David obviously did something to make his son mad, right? But what's crazy is you look at the verses right before this one. When you look at 2 Samuel chapter 14, it actually ends with this reconciliation taking place, David inviting Absalom into his house, embracing him and welcoming him, which explains why for 4 years this could go on, and David has no clue of what's happening, right? Because he thinks things are all good between us. Things are wonderful. Like, we're fine, right? And so Absalom goes on this way. Our assumption is that he's done something, but the reality is David hasn't done anything, which means there's really no good reason for this. That doesn't happen, right? Like, people never accuse you for no good reason, right? People never, stir up a scandal, accuse you of something, right? Usually you've done something to deserve that, right? That's why this is powerful. This is really good. David didn't do anything, and whether it's because we just don't see what we've done, or really maybe we haven't done something, we know exactly what this feels like, right? This is one of those moments you go, why is this sort of thing happening? Verse 13, listen to this. Listen to what happens next. A messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." And then David said to all of his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there'll be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." What ensues in this moment is essentially chaos. I mean, the picture is that people come to David and they say, "David, you need to get your family and your friends and you need to get out of here." And as you read on, there's this picture of them going from house to house and David gathering all of his men, the mighty men who had stood by him, the friends and families, the children. They're literally running through the streets. They're grabbing their belongings and they're running from the city. There's this one scene where David, like a guy at the end of a fire escape, is watching his men go by and he's having this conversation. He's checking with them, and it's almost like a guy watching to make sure everybody's out of the building. There's absolute chaos. This is a revolt. This is an insurrection, and they're running for their lives in this moment. And in the middle of this mess, as you read on in this story, what starts to emerge from this are more stories of betrayal and abandonment. David's friends, many of them turn on him. People that have fought with him for years, people that have been loyal to him, they switch their loyalties. They turn their backs on him. So David's son has undermined him. His friends have betrayed him. And now this guy who's been king for all this time, who knows what it means to be on the run, is on the run again. Like, life is a mess. Ugly, messy. He's battling his friends. And everything about what's happening, everything that's happening in David's life is moving in the opposite direction of what we would consider freedom. Right? He's losing what he fought for. He's losing his freedom. He's now living in fear of somebody, right? Like, how can, like, this is against everything that we understand freedom to be. His rights are being violated. He's being betrayed when he did nothing to deserve it. And then there's this turn of events that takes place, and it's really fascinating. The way this thing goes is really unbelievable. There's a season of running, chasing, battling, and then one particular day, Absalom is out riding his mule. And I'll just say this, like, I picture a mule, and I don't picture very fast. Right? Like, mules don't go fast. But from what we know from the story, Absalom's mule must have been fast. Like, this is like the Ferrari model of a mule. Like, run the Preakness mule, right? Like apparently mules a little different. Because There's a story that Absalom, in the middle of all this battling, David has separated himself from his men, and Joab, David's commander, has been chasing after these guys and trying to catch him. And David really is kind of torn in this whole context of what's happening with his son and the betrayal. And while these guys are out, there's a patrol that sees Absalom. And so Absalom takes off on his mule, which I know for us, you're like, oh, wow, so he's going like 2 miles an hour. But when you hear what happens, you'll know this must have been a fast mule. The mule is running, and it's running through trees. And as it's running through the trees, it's running so fast that it actually goes in through an oak tree, and it hits the oak tree, hits the branches, and he's moving so fast that it sticks Absalom in the air, in the branches of the oak tree. Like he's stuck and living, right? This isn't like I crashed my mule into a tree, and like the mule's over there with the stars and the little thing going around his head. Like, what happened? Like, that's not what happened. Like, the mule runs and then just like keeps going, right? Because mules aren't smart. They're not like silver. You can't come back, The mule's gone. And so like speedily, Absalom is now wedged in this tree and he's hanging there. And there's this guy that comes up and sees him. He goes, how'd you get there? I have a really fast mule. Okay, just like, stop it. All right. People don't think mules are fast, but they're faster than you think, right? There's this whole dialogue. No, that's not in the Bible. This guy sees Absalom, and he's like, this is Absalom. Like, Absalom's stuck in a tree, like, hanging. Literally, the Bible says that he was stuck between heaven and earth, like, hanging there. Like, I don't even know, like, wedged, like, get me down. It's a crazy scene. And this guy realizes, I can't kill Absalom. If you've been here, you've been through this series with us, you know, like David takes this sort of thing really seriously. Like if you kill somebody that David didn't want you to kill, usually that means you're dead. And so this young man sees Absalom, he's like, I'm not going to do it. So he goes to Joab, the commander, and he says, hey, apparently Absalom's mule wedged him in a tree. And so Joab goes, well, did you kill him? And the guy goes, no, I didn't kill him. Like, you know what happens to people that kill people, especially the king's son. I'm not going to do it. And Joab goes, then I'll take care of it. And so there's this scene where Joab takes a bunch of men and spears, and they brutally, they murder Absalom while he's hanging in this tree. Now, before he was taken down from the tree, a messenger ran to David to tell David, your son's alive. After he was murdered, another messenger runs to tell David, David, your son is dead. David's waiting for this messenger. He sees a man running, and then he sees another man running. The first man comes and he says, David, your son is alive. We've captured him. He's alive. The second man comes into the room and he says, David, your son is dead. And there's this interesting thing that happens in 2 Samuel chapter 18. You can read this whole thing up to chapter 18. There's all these events taking place. But in verse 33, listen to what it says, David, how he's responded to this. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." The repetition of my son, Absalom, Absalom, it's this Hebraic expression, it's this exponential emotion that's being added. This is absolute, utter grief. David is grieving from the deepest part of his being. My son, I would have rather died than for you to have been the one to die. This is tragic on so many levels, isn't it? Like you look at this and you go, this is a mess. Like this is the world tilted, right? This is like everything about this is like life kind of as we know it and kind of why we think it's tilted. Some of you know what this feels like. Like it doesn't matter what your kids have done, right? Like some of you know, like it doesn't matter what your kids have done. Like even if they've betrayed you, you know what this is like. Some of you have had experiences where you think, as much as it hurts, as much as they may have pained me, the last thing I want is calamity in their life. And for David, it didn't matter that his son had betrayed him. This is his boy. This is his son. This is his child. He loved him even when he had betrayed him. This is not what David wanted for his life. So now he's weeping, he's grieving. But what if this wasn't his son? Then what? How would David have responded? I was thinking about this week. How would David have responded if this was that punk kid down the street that's always hitting his baseball into my yard, right? I feel that way because I generally I like my kids and I don't like other kids, right? So I get where David's coming from. So then I start thinking about, like, what if this was that kid that we all knew was going to just go south? Like, we knew it. Like, he was stomping in the rose bushes and stealing beer out of the neighbor's fridge when he was 12. Like, what if it was that kid? How would David have responded then? What would he have done then? Would he have wept? Would he have cried? Would David have been grieved if this wasn't his son? The real question that is, what would we do? What would we do? What would we do if this was us? What would we do if we were in this circumstance and this isn't somebody that's related to you? What if somebody's betrayed you? What if somebody has cheated you? What if somebody's lied to you? What if somebody did you wrong? What if you did nothing to deserve it? How do you respond? What's your response to that? What's your response when you look and you get, like this is cut and dry. They practiced injustice. They did something wrong. Like, there's nobody questioning, like saying, oh yeah, well that was a little gray and you did this. Like, what about those times when it's clear? Like this is pretty clear. What about those times when we go, this is so clear that it's not complicated? What do you do in these times? What would you do in this circumstance if it wasn't your son? What's fascinating about this story is that David goes back to Jerusalem, and there's this scene that takes place that's unbelievable, where all of the people that had turned against David, like now that Absalom's dead, they're like, uh-oh, right? We better do something, like this isn't good. So all these people that have turned against David, they start returning to David, right? They were allied with Absalom, and now they come running back. These people that violated his rights, these people that took what he had earned, they returned to him. And the scene plays out in chapter 19, verse 16. It says, in Shimei, the son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And with him were 1,000 men from Benjamin, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and his 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king. Ziba, remember, he's the guy that found Mephibosheth back when we all learned how to say Mephibosheth together. Some of you that weren't here are like, did he just say Mephibosheth? And you're like, I'm sure that means something bad, but it's a person. And they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king, and as he was about to cross the Jordan, and he said to the king, listen to this is really critical. Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. David, would you please forget that time I betrayed you? Right? Do not let the king take it to heart. I didn't mean anything, right? Don't let that sink in. For your servant, he's talking to David, like, you know I have sinned, for your servant knows that I've sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all of the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my lord the king. He's saying, listen, all my brothers and my family, they're going to be rushing down here to apologize too, but I'm the first one, so please kill them, not me. That's basically what he's saying in this moment, right? Like, just forget it. And Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered. Abishai is one of these guys that's been alongside of David. He says, shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? And all God's people said, amen, right? Heck yeah, man. Let's slaughter these guys, right? These aren't your sons. This isn't complicated. This is straightforward, right? What happens next is so incredibly powerful that reading it has the ability to transform our circumstances. Like, we're about to read where the hand of God comes in and just rights the tower. Like this is where things just shift, and you see humanity moving towards God's hope for us. Verse 22, David said, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" Which, by the way, isn't a curse word. That's a slow burn for some of you. You're like, that you should this day be as an adversary to me. Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king gave him his oath. Do you know what this looks like? This is that moment. This is that obscure moment when David responds this way and he says, "Who are you to me? Go, I'll give you my oath." As those words come out of David's mouth, it's as if you can see the wind beneath him, lifting him, and you go, that's freedom, isn't it? Isn't that freedom? Like there's this moment where David is genuinely free. You read the story and there's no doubt about it. David is free. What made him free? I mean, that's the question, because it's obvious. You can just see this life in this moment. What made David free? Why is he free? Is it because he got his rights back? He got his house back, right? Like David's life's like a country song you play backwards, right? You get your truck back, your house back, your dog back, right? Like in this moment, reverse the country song, it's all back. Is that why, does he got what he deserved? He got what he had earned? He got his stuff back? Is that why David's free in this moment? See, that's what we think, right? We think, okay, David's okay in this moment, and he's okay not seeking revenge because David got the freedom things that we associate with freedom reinstated to him. And so that allows him to respond this sort of way. Things are back in order. We're good, right? Interestingly enough, there's this moment back in his running from Absalom when things were a mess and he didn't have anything, when he wrote a psalm, Psalm 63. And when you read that psalm, you know what impression you get from David as you read that psalm? He was free. David was free long before this moment. David was free when he was running. David was free when he didn't have a kingdom and his friends had betrayed him. David was free. There was this lightness to his life. The burden was lifted. Why is David so free? How does this happen? The answer is forgiveness. It's forgiveness. That's it. That's freedom. Forgiveness. How does a father weep for a son who's betrayed him? It's forgiveness. It's the only way that he could weep. There's forgiveness. How does a leader welcome back those who had turned their backs on him? It's forgiveness. Freedom is found in forgiveness. That's where we discover freedom, when we forgive. Freedom is found. Freedom is experienced, that lightness. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's this moment when you forgive, and when you forgive, there's something that happens where the burden is gone, like it's just lifted. There's a lightness. Something changes. You can't describe it in words. You just know that it's happened, right? Freedom is found in forgiveness. It's not found in your rights being reinstated. It's not found in people getting what they deserved or obtaining what you lost. That's not what gives freedom. All of those things that we do demanding freedom, all of those things, they're just like building layers on that tower when it's forgiveness that rights it. Forgiveness is what makes you live free. And here's what's really cool about this story and what I love about this. This is what's so great about it. This isn't just another, okay, you need to go forgive talk. Like this isn't like, oh, here goes the preacher again telling us that we need to forgive as we've been forgiven, yada, 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 right? That's not what this is. There's something actually in this story. There's a moment in this story, and it reveals the motivation to forgive. It reveals how David could become that person. David says something that's remarkable in this, and it's what makes forgiveness possible. That's so powerful because I can tell you to forgive. I can say, you know what, you need to forgive. And you go, you know what, you're right. I mean, here can we just be honest? And here's we all know this to be true. We know that forgiveness leads to freedom. We know that. Those of us that have ever experienced extending forgiveness, we've been freed. We know that. The problem is we don't know how to forgive. So I can say to you, you need to go forgive. And what do? Like you grit your teeth and you clench your fists and you're like, okay. And like every day you wake up and you're like, I want to forgive you, right? God, forgiving you, right? You're just like walking around. You're like, yeah, that's working great, man. You look free, don't you? That's freedom embodied, right? This is awesome. See, that's the problem, is that we can do this and we can flex our muscles and try to do it, and we never discover what real forgiveness is. And then there's this example that David gives us, and he actually shows us how he was able to be free. Look back at what he says at verse 22 in chapter 19. When this guy says, don't kill me, forget all the things I did to you. David said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Well, I can't answer that question. You've been an adversary for a while now, right? But then listen to what David says. Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? My response isn't to go kill you and to get even with you and to do these sorts of things. But here's why. And here's what's so powerful. You've got to catch this. For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? Do you see what David's saying to him? Do I not know that I'm king over Israel? Do I have to prove something to you? Do I have to prove something to everybody else that's watching us have this conversation? Do I have to prove something to me? Do you see what David's doing here? Do you see what's happening here? What David is saying is, I don't find my identity in you. I don't find my identity in you. I don't find my identity in whether or not you're my adversary or not, whether or not you approve of me or not. I don't find my identity in whether or not you have a good opinion of me. I'm not defined by you or whether or not the things between us are okay. Like that doesn't matter to me, for I know that I'm the king of Israel this day. I'm not defined by the circumstances surrounding me or the relationships or the good or the bad. What David is saying is this. He's saying, listen, I'm completely confident in who God sees me to be, and so who am I? I have nothing to prove. This relationship doesn't define me. I'm completely removed and above this whole dialogue because all I care about is God's view of me in this moment. And because I don't need you to apologize and because I don't need to get even, I'm free to forgive you. It doesn't matter. Go read some books. Just sends him on his way, right? So the reason that we're not free is that we can't forgive. And the reason that we can't forgive is that we continue to allow ourselves to be defined by the conversation, by the outcome of the relationship, by whether or not that person has ever let me speak my mind to them, by whether or not they've ever apologized. We're letting them define our freedom. The reason we can't forgive is because our freedom is dependent upon their opinion of us. We care what they think. We want to let that boss who let me go, I'm really a good guy, I'm a harder worker than you thought I was, and there's something inside of us that we just can't let it go because we never got a chance to state our case, right? that person that walked out, we just go, man, you know what, we're still letting that define us. We're still letting that wound us and hurt us. Why? Because we just want there to be resolution. We want to solve this. We want to fix this thing. We need people to apologize. We need people to know the truth. We need people to think rightly about us. That will allow us. We think if somehow I can just settle all this stuff, then I'll be free enough to forgive. And David says, listen, I don't need you to tell me. I mean, you can read Psalm 63 or other Psalms that he's written. He just says, listen, God and I are good, and he defines my identity. He defines my worth. And that doesn't make me arrogant, and that doesn't make me better than you, but it does mean that you don't define me. I don't find my value in whether or not you're okay and I'm okay and everyone's good with each other. Which means you don't get to control my freedom. So some of you, there are situations that you need to let go of, that you need to offer forgiveness to. There are people, there are relationships, there are organizations. It might be something as benign as the stock market. I don't know. Like there may be governments. There are things that you're upset about. There are people that have hurt you. There are people that have wounded you. They've let you down. And the reality is, I mean, we all have wounds, but we will carry those wounds. And unless we get to a point where we stop letting the resolution of those things define us and let God, we'll never be as free as David is. When I forgive, I'm free. I set them free, but that's what makes me free. That person, that organization, when you forgive them, you set them free, but you're setting yourself free. And you're only listening to the voice of a God who says, I love you. I care about you. A God who created you to be free. He created you to be free from bitterness and from pain and from revenge and from judgment and from criticism. That's who He created you. He doesn't want you to carry that burden. He wants you to be that child playing in the front yard with that lightness. And He says, just listen to what I say about you. Listen to what I say about you. Forgiveness is what sets us free. And the only way you can forgive is when you truly are defined by what God says about you. And David got that. He just did. David knew God's forgiveness. He'd experienced His forgiveness. He knew His love, and that's why he could say, I know who I am. I don't have to do this. Now, it's interesting that if we have a God who's reaching into our world and saying, I want to right this thing, wouldn't it make sense? Wouldn't it make sense that if writing this thing, if putting this pressure against this brokenness meant us doing something that meant we responded to knowing how much God loved us? Don't you think that if our living this free, forgiven life is dependent on our awareness of our position in God, don't you think He would do something very specific, something very powerful to remind us, look at who you are in my view? Doesn't it make sense that He would do that? Like if God wants to see the tower straight, and that depends on us being able to know where we are with Him, wouldn't it make sense He would do something that's so powerful that we can't help but look at it and go, yeah, man, I can do this. I can forgive and I can right this. I can bring this to the world. There's this really interesting moment in the upper room with Jesus and His disciples right before the crucifixion, where Jesus takes the bread and He takes the cup. And He institutes a ritual, which is fascinating. Because if you know Jesus, you realize, if you read about Jesus, what was Jesus always doing? He was undoing ritual all the time, right? He was violating the religious practices all the time. And then in this final moment before the crucifixion, we have Jesus instituting a ritual. What is that ritual? The ritual is, he says, take the bread and take the cup. And he says, eat this bread and drink this cup in remembrance of me. Don't stop doing this. Why? Because I want you to know. You can never forget, if you are going to participate in setting this world to rights, if you're going to be the one person who experiences the feelings of freedom, it's going to require that you're continually reminded of my great love for you. We hold the bread and we hold the cup in our hands. It's God speaking to us and saying, I love you. You were so broken. You're this beautiful but off-kilter tower. And he says, you're broken, but I love you. I love you. I care about you. And he's saying, I don't want you to be defined by those relationships that are broken and those things that have happened. I don't want you to find your value. He just says, listen, I love you. And then he says, remember that, because every time we hold the bread and we hold the cup, he brings us back and he goes, man, you can do this. You can forgive. You can be free. So the ushers are going to come, and we do this every month. Sometimes you'll go, we do? Yeah, we do. We take communion every month. Why? Because Jesus said to. He said every third Sunday. Just kidding. He didn't. He just said, keep doing it. And I think we know why. So the ushers are going to pass out the bread and the cup, and this morning we're going to take them together. So when you get them, just hold them. And while you're holding them and while the worship team plays, I just want to encourage you to do this. Would you spend some time and just look into your heart and look into your relationships and look into your life, and would you just start evaluating and asking the question, are you still letting something define you? Are you still letting somebody else and the resolution of that thing shape you? Or are you letting this define you? And if this is defining you, then take this time and offer forgiveness. Just say, God, I have to forgive, and I'm going to do it because I know who I am in your sight.